In the unforgiving dust of the Dakota territory, a woman's worth was measured in wide hips for birthing, calloused hands for farming, and a pretty face to brighten a homesteader's bleak existence. Rebecca Caldwell had none of these. Deemed too plain, too slender a whisper of a woman, in a land that roared, she faced a future as barren as the winter plains. Every eligible man in the bustling town of Redemption had dismissed her, their gazes sliding past her as if she were a shadow. But shadows listen, and in the quietest corner of the territory, one man, a man of few words and deep sorrows, heard something no one else had bothered to listen for the sound of her voice. It was a voice that held the power to soothe a restless soul, a voice that could unravel the darkest of secrets. And in Redemption, a town built on secrets, a voice like hers was more dangerous than any gun. The year of our Lord, 1883, found Redemption, Dakota Territory in a state of feverish growth. The Northern Pacific Railway had sliced through the prairie, and with it came a torrent of humanity, all seeking a sliver of fortune from the vast, unforgiving land. The town was a raw, chaotic symphony of hammering saws, the shrill whistle of the train, and the boisterous laughter of men who believed they were taming a wild frontier. For most, it was a place of opportunity. For Rebecca Caldwell, it was a cage of polite smiles and averted eyes. At 24, Rebecca was a fixture in her father's mercantile, a silent, efficient presence amidst the barrels of flour bolts of calico and sacks of mail that connected Redemption to the world beyond. She was not ugly, not in the way that would make a horse shy. Instead, she was unnoticeable. Her hair was the color of dried prairie grass, her eyes a muted hazel, and her frame as slight as a sapling in a land that valued the sturdiness of an oak. Her quiet nature born of a childhood spent with a perpetually grieving mother, and a father who communicated in ledgers and accounts was mistaken for dimness. The Cowboy's rough-hewn men, with sun-crinkled eyes and swaggering gaits, were the arbiters of social standing in Redemption. Men like Silas Blackwood, whose father owned the largest cattle ranch in the county. Silas, with his polished boots, silver-inlaid belt buckle, and a cruel curl to his lip, was the town's unofficial prince. He and his coterie of ranch hands, men with names like Gus Walt and Frank, treated the town as their personal fiefdom. They would stride into the Caldwell mercantile, their spurs ringing on the floorboards, and Rebecca would become invisible. They would flirt with the Miller sisters, known for their buxom figures and easy laughter, or compliment young Clara May, whose golden curls were the talk of the county. They would tip their hats to her father. Augustus Caldwell, a man respected for his business acumen, but their eyes would pass over Rebecca as if she were a sack of potatoes. Each rejection was a small, sharp paper cut to her soul. There was the town social where she had worn her best blue dress, the color of a twilight sky, and had stood by the punch bowl for 2 hours, the smile on her face growing stiffer with each passing minute as no one asked her to dance. There was the Sunday service where she would see the eligible men of the town escorting other young women home, their laughter echoing in the crisp air as she walked the dusty path back to the mercantile alone. Her father, a man of practicality, saw her unmarried status as a failing in his ledger. "A daughter of your age should be settled," he'd say, not unmeanly, but with the detached air of a man calculating inventory. "You are a good worker, Rebecca. You would make a fine wife for a respectable man. Perhaps you should smile more." Rebecca did smile, but her smiles were quiet, fleeting things, not the broad, dazzling displays that seemed to capture a man's attention. Her worth, she had come to believe, was as plain and unremarkable as her appearance. Then there was Jedediah Thorne. Jedediah was as much a part of the redemption landscape as the dust and the wind, yet he remained separate from it. He was a homesteader, working a plot of land a few miles out of town, a place whispered to be cursed by bad soil and worse luck. He was a quiet man, with a stillness about him that was unnerving to the boisterous townsfolk. He was tall, but he didn't swagger. His shoulders were broad from labor, not from bravado. His face was a road map of some unspoken sorrow, with deep-set dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything and reflect nothing. He spoke so rarely that a two-word greeting from him was a topic of conversation at the saloon for an hour. The other cowboys and ranchers treated him with a wide berth. They called him Ghost, or Mute, behind his back. They whispered stories about his past, that he'd been a soldier, and seen unspeakable things, that he'd lost a family to cholera, that he was a man running from a crime. Jedediah never confirmed or denied any of it. He would come into the mercantile once a month, his list of supplies clutched in a calloused hand. He would nod a greeting to Augustus, gather his flour, salt, and coffee, and pay in solid coin, his eyes never lingering his presence, as unobtrusive as a passing breeze. Rebecca, from her corner of the store, watched him. She noticed the way his hands, though rough, were gentle as he inspected a tool. She saw the weariness in his posture, a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond physical labor. And she saw in the fleeting moments his gaze would accidentally meet hers, a flicker of something she recognized, a profound and unshakable loneliness. One brutal afternoon in late August, when the heat shimmered in waves off the parched earth, the mercantile was a hive of activity. A new train had arrived, and with it a fresh wave of settlers and a backlog of mail. Rebecca was tasked with sorting the letters and parcels, her fingers nimble as she deciphered the spidery handwriting and called out names. "Letter for Mrs. Adelaide Miller." She called, her voice clear and steady. "Package for the Blackwood Ranch. Telegram for Sheriff Brody." Her voice, usually so soft in conversation, carried through the crowded store. It was a voice unlike the high-pitched giggles of the other young women, or the nasal drawl common in the territory. It was a voice like honey and smoke, with a low melodic timbre that was both soothing and clear. In the cacophony of the mercantile, it was a pure, resonant note. As she called out the names, she was unaware of the pair of dark eyes that had stopped their perusal of axe handles and were now fixed on her. Jedediah Thorne stood by the far wall, his usual list of supplies forgotten. He had come into town for salt and nails, a journey he undertook with grim necessity. He disliked the noise, the crowds, the forced pleasantries. He was about to leave, overwhelmed by the press of bodies, when he heard it. Her voice. It cut through the din like a homing beacon. It wasn't loud, but it had a quality, a richness that seemed to settle in the air. He watched as she moved her slender form, weaving through the chaos with a quiet grace he'd never noticed before. He saw the furrow of concentration on her brow, the slight unconscious smile that touched her lips when she recognized a name. The townsfolk in their hurry and bluster saw only the plain girl sorting mail. Jedediah, for the first time, truly saw Rebecca Caldwell, and more importantly, he heard her. He waited. He waited as the crowd thinned as Silas Blackwood and his cronies swaggered out, leaving a trail of cigar smoke and arrogant laughter. He waited as Augustus Caldwell retired to his office to tally the day's earnings. He waited until only Rebecca remained tidying the counter, her movements methodical and weary. He approached the counter slowly so as not to startle her. She looked up, her hazel eyes widening in surprise. It was the longest she had ever been under his direct gaze. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice now back to its usual soft volume. "I'm sorry, did you need something? I didn't see you." Of course you didn't, he thought. No one ever does. He swallowed the simple act of speaking in this context, feeling foreign and monumental. He pushed his forgotten list across the counter. "I need these things," he said. His voice was rusty, a low baritone, unused to forming more than a word or two at a time. Rebecca's eyes scanned the list. "Flour, salt, nails, coffee. I can get those for you." She turned to gather the items, her back to him. The silence stretched thick and heavy. He should leave. He had what he came for. But he couldn't. "Miss Caldwell," he said the name, feeling strange on his tongue. She turned back, a 50-pound sack of flour in her arms, a question in her eyes. "The way you were calling out the names." He began his words, slow and deliberate. "For the mail. I've never heard a voice like it." Rebecca stared at him, bewildered. Of all the things a man could say to her, this was the last she would have ever expected. Not a compliment on her dress, which she'd mended twice. Not a comment on her hair, which she knew was drab. He was talking about her voice. A faint blush rose to her cheeks, a rare and delicate color. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Thorne. I was just reading the names." "You do more than read them," he said, a surprising intensity in his dark eyes. "You give them life." And then, as if he had expended his entire store of words for the year, he nodded curtly, paid for his supplies with coins. He placed carefully on the counter and was gone, leaving Rebecca standing in the quiet mercantile with the scent of dust and coffee and the echo of the most peculiar compliment she had ever received. For the first time in her life, someone had seen past her plain face and quiet demeanor. Someone had looked at Rebecca Caldwell and found something worthy of comment. And it wasn't her looks, her hands, or her ability to run a ledger. It was her voice. A part of her, she had never considered a part of her, that until that moment she hadn't truly valued herself. The quiet homesteader had asked for her voice, and in doing so he had given her a flicker of something she hadn't realized. She'd lost hope. The encounter with Jedediah Thorne left Rebecca in a state of quiet turmoil. His words, so unexpected and sincere, were a stone dropped into the still stagnant pool of her existence, the ripples expanding in ever-widening circles. For days, she found herself replaying the moment, the way his dark, sorrowful eyes had met hers, the rough, hesitant timbre of his voice. He had noticed something about her that she herself had overlooked. It made her listen. She started to pay attention to the sound of her own voice, the way it rose and fell, as she read from the Bible to her ailing mother Martha in the evenings. Martha Caldwell was a woman faded by years of unspoken grief over the loss of 2 infant sons before Rebecca's birth. She spent most of her days in a rocking chair by the window, her gaze fixed on the endless prairie, her mind seemingly as distant. Rebecca's reading was one of the few things that seemed to bring a flicker of awareness to her mother's eyes. One evening, as Rebecca read from the Book of Psalms, her voice filling the small, dimly lit room, she found a new cadence, a new emotion in the familiar words. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want," she read, and the words were no longer just text on a page. They were a melody, a balm. She looked up to see a tear tracing a path down her mother's withered cheek. "That was beautiful, Rebecca," Martha whispered, her voice a fragile rustle of leaves, like an angel singing. The comparison struck a chord deep within Rebecca. An angel's song. It was a fanciful notion in a place as practical and unforgiving as redemption. But the idea took root. What if her voice was more than just a tool for calling out names? Her secret began in the root cellar. It was the one place she could be assured of absolute privacy. Down amongst the earthy scent of potatoes and preserved peaches, with only the flickering light of a single lantern, Rebecca started to sing. At first it was just the hymns she knew from church, her voice hesitant and shy. But as the days turned into weeks, a new confidence bloomed in the cool, dark space. She began to experiment to let her voice soar and dip, to weave melodies from the fragments of tunes she'd heard from passing wagons or the rare traveling musician. She discovered a gift she never knew she possessed. Her voice had a natural richness and a surprising range. It could be as clear and bright as a mountain spring, or as low and mournful as a winter wind. In the confines of the cellar, she sang of the vast, lonely prairie, of the bitterness of a Dakota winter, of the silent hopes she kept locked in her heart. She sang the stories she was too shy to speak. Meanwhile, in town, the seeds of drama were being sown. Silas Blackwood, his arrogance bolstered by his father's wealth and influence, had set his sights on Clara May, the belle of the county. He saw her as another prize to be won, a beautiful accessory to complement his own status. But Silas had a rival, a fact that chafed at his pride. A young ambitious surveyor from back east named Mr. Alistair Finch had recently arrived in Redemption. Finch was handsome, educated, and possessed a smooth, charming demeanor that contrasted sharply with Silas's rough-edged swagger. He too was courting Clara May, and the competition between the two men was a source of constant gossip. The tension came to a head at the annual Harvest Festival. The entire county turned out for the event, a rare celebration in a life defined by hard work. There were games of skill tables groaning with food and a makeshift dance floor laid out in the center of town. Rebecca attended with her father, expecting her usual role as a wallflower. She watched as Silas Blackwood, dressed in his finest, cornered Clara May, near the apple-bobbing barrel. His words were low and possessive, and Clara May's bright smile faltered. Moments later, Alistair Finch appeared, offering Clara May a cup of cider with a gallant bow. The two men exchanged a look of pure venom over the top of Clara May's golden curls. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Later that evening, the fiddler struck up a lively tune. Alistair Finch, ever the gentleman, led Clara May onto the dance floor. Silas watched from the sidelines, his face a thundercloud. He downed a flask of whiskey, his eyes dark with fury. Gus and Walt, his ever-present shadows, flanked him, whispering encouragement. Rebecca, standing near the mercantile's darkened doorway, saw it all. She saw the jealousy twisting Silas's features, the genuine affection in Alistair's eyes, as he twirled Clara May, and the frightened, uncertain look that Clara May tried to hide. As the dance ended, a drunken Silas stumbled forward, grabbing Alistair by the shoulder. "You think you can just come here and take what you want, Easterner?" He slurred his voice loud enough to silence the crowd. Alistair calmly removed Silas's hand. "I believe the lady is free to choose her own company, Blackwood." "She chose me!" Silas roared, his face purpling with rage. "And you do well to remember that." He shoved Alistair hard, sending him stumbling backward into a table of pies. The crowd gasped. Sheriff Brodie, a man whose authority was often challenged by the Blackwood influence, moved forward hesitantly. But before he could intervene, Alistair, his coat now smeared with pumpkin filling, straightened his tie and met Silas's glare. "Your methods of persuasion are as crude as your manners, Blackwood," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. The insult hung in the air, a direct challenge to Silas's pride. Silas, never one to back down from a fight, especially a public one, lunged. The two men crashed to the ground, fists flying. The festival erupted into chaos. Women screamed, men shouted, and the once joyful atmosphere turned ugly and violent. Rebecca watched in horror as the brawl escalated, Silas's ranch hands joining the fray. It was a brutal, senseless display of ego and jealousy. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. This was the world she lived in, a world where men fought like dogs over a prize, where beauty was a commodity, and where a quiet heart had no value. Fleeing the ugliness, she retreated to the one place she felt safe, the dark, silent mercantile. Her father was busy helping the sheriff, and for a few moments she was blessedly alone. The anger, the frustration, the crushing loneliness of it all welled up inside her. She didn't want to cry. She wanted to scream. Instead, she sang. She stumbled down the stairs to the root cellar, her sanctuary. The chaos from the street above was a muted rumble. She lit her lantern, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows, and then she opened her mouth and let out all the pain and disillusionment in a single, soaring melody. It was a song of her own, making a lament for the ugliness she had just witnessed. It was a song about the fragility of peace and the foolishness of pride. Her voice, untethered by fear or shyness, filled the cellar, vibrating through the wooden shelves, echoing off the stone walls. It was a sound of raw, pure emotion, more powerful than any fist, more potent than any shouted threat. She sang with her eyes closed, lost in the music, lost in the release it provided. She didn't hear the soft creak of the cellar door. She didn't see the tall figure that slipped inside, drawn by the impossible sound. Jedediah Thorne had been on the edge of the festival, a reluctant observer drawn in by the promise of a rare, hot meal he didn't have to cook himself. He had seen the fight break out, the same tired, predictable display of male aggression he'd seen 1,000 times before. Disgusted, he had turned to leave, to retreat to the solace of his lonely homestead. As he passed the darkened mercantile, he heard it, a sound so pure and beautiful it stopped him in his tracks. It was a woman's voice, singing, but it was more than that. It was the voice he had heard calling the male, the voice that had haunted his thoughts for weeks now, unleashed in a torrent of heart-breaking melody. He followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. It led him to the back of the store, to the open door of the root cellar. He descended the stairs quietly, his worn boots making no sound on the packed earth. And there she was, Rebecca Caldwell, the plain, unseen woman, bathed in the golden light of a single lantern, her face transformed by the music pouring from her. She was no longer the quiet shop girl. She was a siren, a Valkyrie, a creature of myth and magic. The sound she produced was the most beautiful, most powerful thing he had ever heard. He stood in the shadows, listening, utterly captivated. He, a man who had walled off his heart, who had sworn off all connection to a world that had brought him nothing but pain, felt a crack in his armor. He had come to redemption, to be silent, to be invisible, to let the world forget him. But in the darkness of the root cellar, surrounded by the scent of earth and the sound of an angel's lament, Jedediah Thorne felt the stirrings of something he thought long dead. He had asked for her voice, and she had answered with her soul. When her song finally faded, the silence that followed was profound. Rebecca opened her eyes, her chest heaving, a sense of peace settling over her. And then she saw him, a tall silhouette standing by the stairs. A gasp escaped her lips. The peace shattered, replaced by a mortifying wave of shame and fear. "Mr. Thorne, what are you doing here?" Jedediah stepped forward into the light, his face a mixture of awe and something else, something she couldn't decipher. I heard you singing," he said, his voice rough. "I'm sorry to intrude. I couldn't help myself." Rebecca's face burned with embarrassment. Her secret was out. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't tell anyone. My father. He wouldn't understand." "Understand what?" Jedediah asked, taking another step closer. "That you have the voice of an angel hidden away in a cellar." He looked around the small, cramped space at the jars of preserves and sacks of vegetables. "You shouldn't be singing for the potatoes, Miss Caldwell," he said, his gaze returning to her face. "A voice like that, it belongs to the world." His words, meant as a compliment, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. The world. The world was the harvest festival. It was Silas Blackwood's drunken rage and the averted eyes of the cowboys. The world was a place that had no use for her. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, you don't understand. The world doesn't want to hear me." "I do," Jedediah said, his voice soft but firm. A stark contrast to the violence they had both just witnessed. "I want to hear you." In the flickering lantern light, two lonely souls stood, a secret melody hanging in the air between them. Outside the town of Redemption was nursing its wounds, blissfully unaware that its most overlooked resident possessed a gift that could change everything. And the quietest man in the territory had just become its sole keeper. The drama of redemption was no longer just about land cattle and pretty faces. It now had a new secret soundtrack. The secret of the root cellar became a fragile, sacred bond between Rebecca and Jedediah. He began finding reasons to come to town more often, his visits no longer confined to a monthly supply run, a broken harness buckle, a query about a new type of seed. These were thin pretexts, and they both knew it. The true purpose was the few stolen moments of conversation at the counter, which always ended with his whispered, hopeful question, "Will you be singing tonight?" And she would. After her father retired for the evening, Rebecca would light her lantern and descend to the cool, dark cellar. Soon after, Jedediah would slip in a silent shadow, settling onto an overturned crate. His presence did not make her nervous. It made her brave. Singing for him, for his quiet, unwavering attention, was a form of validation she had never known. She sang hymns, folk tunes, and the new melodies that sprang from her own heart, and in his eyes, she was not the plain shop girl, but an artist. For Jedediah, these secret concerts were a balm on a soul flayed raw by grief. The whispers in town were only a fraction of the truth. He had survived the war, but he had come home to Ohio to find his world annihilated. His wife Mary and their little boy Samuel had been taken by a swift and merciless cholera epidemic. The silence of his empty farmhouse had become a scream of loss he couldn't escape. He fled west, seeking a land vast enough to swallow his pain, a place to become anonymous. Rebecca's voice was the first beautiful thing that had pierced the thick grey fog of his sorrow. It didn't erase the ghosts, but it made them bearable. Such a delicate harmony, however, could not remain a secret in a town like Redemption, which ran on a currency of whispers. The Miller sisters were the first to note the mute homesteader's frequent visits. Their observations soon travelled to the saloon, and from there to the ears of Silas Blackwood. Silas, having successfully intimidated his rival for Clara May's affections, was feeling particularly arrogant. He didn't want Rebecca, but the idea that the town's other outcast, the silent and unsettling Jedediah Thorne, might see something of value in her was a personal affront. It was an aberration in the town's social order, and it amused him to correct it. He chose his moment one afternoon, sauntering into the mercantile with his ever-present shadows, Gus and Walt. Jedediah was there, speaking quietly with Rebecca about different types of fencing wire. "Well, well," Silas drawled, leaning his considerable bulk against a barrel. "Look what we have here. The mute and the mouse sharing secrets. What's the matter, Thorne? Finally get tired of talking to your rocks?" Jedediah's jaw tightened, but he gave no other reaction. He turned his back slightly, creating a subtle shield between Silas and Rebecca. "I'll take 20 yards of the barbed wire, Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice steady. Silas refused to be ignored. He swaggered to the counter, his spurs ringing with menace. "I'm talking to you, ghost," he sneered, invading Jedediah's space. "Or did the war take your hearing as well as your nerve?" The mention of the war was a deliberate, cruel strike. Jedediah went rigid, the stillness in his body suddenly dangerous. The air in the store grew thick and heavy. "That's enough, Silas," Rebecca said, her own voice, small but firm. Silas turned his venomous gaze on her, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "You stay out of this, girl. This is men's business." He looked her up and down with theatrical disdain. "Though I can't imagine what business any man would have with you unless he's buying rope to hang himself." The casual public cruelty was like a slap. Tears of helpless anger pricked Rebecca's eyes, and that was the final straw. The carefully constructed dam of Jedediah's composure, built over years of stoic silence and buried grief, finally broke. He turned not with explosive rage, but with a cold, terrifying quietness that was far more intimidating. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at Silas, and the promises of violence he'd witnessed on battlefields flickered in his dark eyes, wiping the smirk clean off Silas's face. "You will apologize to the lady," Jedediah said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Gus and Walt shifted uneasily, a primal instinct warning them that this was not the harmless mute they thought they knew. But Silas was too proud to back down. "Or what?" he spat. "You'll glare me to death." Jedediah's hand shot out with startling speed, grabbing the front of Silas's expensive shirt. In one smooth, shocking display of strength, he lifted the larger man, hoisting him until his polished boots dangled inches from the floorboards. Silas's eyes bulged in a mixture of shock and primal fear. The man's strength was inhuman. "I won't," Jedediah said, his face a mask of cold fury. "Ask again." At that moment, Augustus Caldwell emerged from his office, drawn by the sudden tense silence. He took in the scene at a glance, his daughter's tear-streaked face the town bully held aloft, and the terrifying stranger holding him. He saw only the violence, not the cause. "Thorne, release him this instant," Augustus commanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. "There will be no brawling in my establishment." Jedediah held Silas for one moment longer, his eyes burning with a promise of future retribution. Then, with a grunt of disgust, he dropped him. Silas stumbled back, gasping for air, his bravado shattered. "Get out," Augustus said, but his trembling, pointing finger was aimed not at Silas, but at Jedediah. And don't come back. I've heard the whispers about you. I won't have a violent brute like you frightening my customers and threatening my daughter." Rebecca's heart plummeted. "Father, no. You don't understand. It was Silas who—" "I saw what I saw." "Rebecca," her father cut her off sharply. "This man is trouble. His business is no longer welcome here." Jedediah looked at Rebecca, and in his eyes she saw a storm of emotions: regret for breaking his silence, anger at the injustice, and a profound, familiar sorrow. He had allowed the world's ugliness to touch him again, and in defending her honor, he had lost their sanctuary. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the mercantile, the bell above the door chiming a final lonely toll. Silas, recovering his swagger, straightened his shirt and shot a triumphant, venomous look at Rebecca. He nodded curtly to her father. "Thank you for your timely intervention, Mr. Caldwell. It's good to see there are still respectable men in this town." With that parting shot, he and his cronies left their arrogant laughter echoing in the street. That night, the root cellar was cold and silent. Rebecca sat on the steps, the lantern casting a lonely circle of light on the packed earth. Jedediah did not come. The harmony was broken. She was once again the unseen woman, but the loneliness was sharper, now more acute, because she had known for a few precious weeks what it was to be heard. But as she sat there in the silence, a new feeling began to smolder beneath the pain, a quiet, defiant anger. They had taken her friend. They had taken her music. She would not let them take her voice. The banishment of Jedediah Thorne plunged Rebecca into a quiet, simmering despair. The mercantile, once a place of secret glances and hopeful anticipation, now felt like the court the town had always intended it to be. Her father, convinced he had saved her from a dangerous association, was sterner than ever, his presence a constant, silent judgment. The town's gossip, meanwhile, solidified the injustice into accepted fact. Jedediah was a violent brute, Silas Blackwood, a wronged gentleman, and Rebecca, a foolish girl caught between them. But the incident had ignited a slow-burning fuse within her. The casual cruelty, the willful blindness, it chipped away at her ingrained timidity, replacing it with a harder, sharper resolve. The root cellar was no longer just a sanctuary. It became her workshop. The songs she composed in the earthy darkness changed. Her melodies, once filled with a vague personal melancholy, now carried narratives. They became fables, sharp and observant, targeting the hypocrisy she saw every day. She wrote a song about a vain peacock who believed he owned the farmyard, only to be terrified by his own reflection in a puddle. The allegory was so thin it was transparent, and as she sang it to the silent jars of peaches, a fierce, unfamiliar smile touched her lips. She followed it with a more tender ballad, a story of a good man who built a wall of silent stone around his heart. It was a lament and a prayer for Jedediah sent out into the vast, lonely prairie night. Her chance to unveil these creations came from an unexpected corner. The Redemption Community Church was in dire need of funds to repair its leaking roof. Reverend Dodson, a well-meaning but often flustered man, announced a town fundraiser social, calling for donations of pies, quilts, and most desperately entertainment. "We must lift our spirits, friends," he declared from the pulpit. "Does anyone possess a talent they would be willing to share for this good cause?" After a few unenthusiastic volunteers offered clumsy piano duets and tired poetry recitations, Rebecca felt a surge of cold adrenaline. It was now or never. Before the impulse could flee, she stood, her slender form trembling in the quiet church. "Reverend," she said, her voice clear and steady in the still air. "I can sing." A murmur rippled through the pews. Rebecca Caldwell. The quiet mouse from the mercantile. Reverend Dodson blinked in surprise. "Why, Rebecca, my dear, that's wonderful." "We would be simply delighted." Her father shot her a look of pure astonishment, a mixture of confusion and stern disapproval, but he could hardly forbid it in the house of God. The die was cast. The night of the fundraiser, the town hall was packed, the air thick with the smell of coffee and damp wool. Waiting behind a makeshift curtain, Rebecca felt a wave of nausea. Her hands were ice cold. This was a mistake. They would laugh. They would see her as they always had, plain awkward, insignificant. But then she thought of Jedediah on his lonely homestead, banished because of her. She pictured Silas Blackwood sitting in the front row with a proprietary arm draped around Clara May. She thought of her father, who saw her worth only as an entry in a ledger. The anger returned a welcome heat that burned away the fear. When her name was called, she walked onto the small stage. She carried no instrument, only a simple wooden stool. A hush of pity and morbid curiosity fell over the crowd. She avoided their faces, fixing her gaze on a point on the back wall. She took a single deep breath and began. She did not sing a hymn. She sang of the peacock. Her voice, the one honed in secret, filled the hall. It was a sound no one in Redemption was prepared for. It wasn't the delicate, trained warbling of a society lady. It was raw, resonant, and powerful. It soared to the rafters and dipped to a conspiratorial whisper, weaving a story with undeniable skill. Oh, the peacock struts with his chest, all puffed his tail, a jeweled fan. He believes the hens all swoon for him, the finest in the land. A stunned silence gripped the room. Then came the whispers, the nudges, the dawning collective realization. They knew exactly who the peacock was. From the stage, Rebecca saw Silas Blackwood's smug expression curdle his hand tightening on Clara May's arm. She saw the Miller sisters exchange wide-eyed, scandalized looks, and she felt a dizzying surge of power. They were listening. For the very first time, they were all listening to her. She didn't give them time to recover. She moved seamlessly from one song to the next, becoming a musical bard for the town's unspoken truths. She sang of the merchant who watered his whiskey, the pious widow who cheated at cards, the sanctimonious pronouncements made on Sunday versus the sins committed on Saturday night. She wasn't just singing. She was holding up a mirror, and the reflection was making Redemption squirm. For her final number, her tone shifted. The anger fell away, replaced by a profound tenderness. This song was for Jedediah. Her voice softened, filled with a sorrow so palpable it silenced every rustle and cough in the hall. She sang of the man with the wall around his heart. He built his walls of silent stone to keep the ghosts at bay, and locked the door on yesterday to face a sunless day. But a heart that's safe from breaking, she concluded, her voice nearly a whisper, is a heart that cannot feel at all. The final note hung in the air, vibrating with heart-breaking purity. In the breathless silence that followed, the entire town seemed to be holding its breath, stunned. Then from the back of the hall, a single deliberate clap broke the spell. It was Sheriff Brody. Another person joined in, and then another, until the hall erupted in a thunderous, resounding ovation. It was not polite applause. It was a roar of recognition, of gratitude, of awe. Rebecca looked out at the sea of faces, faces that had ignored her for years, and saw respect. She saw her father, his expression a mask of disbelief, but with a flicker of undeniable pride in his eyes. The most important listener, however, was not in the hall. The windows had been propped open, and the music had spilled into the cool night. Across the street, a tall figure stood in the shadows, having heard every note. Jedediah Thorne had heard her defiance, her fury, and her love all woven into song. He had heard her call to him. The fundraiser was a triumph. Rebecca Caldwell, the invisible woman, was suddenly the only person anyone in Redemption wanted to talk about. But her victory came at a price. She had done more than sing. She had publicly humiliated a powerful man. Silas Blackwood, and by extension his father Ebenezer, would not suffer such an insult. Respect and fear were the currencies they dealt in, and Rebecca had just devalued their stock. The song of redemption had been sung, but a darker, more violent melody was about to begin. The Blackwood threat arrived not with a bang, but with a slip of paper under the mercantile door. The ink was crude, the message chillingly direct. "Tell your daughter to silence her songs, or we will silence them for her." No signature was needed. The message carried the implicit brand of Ebenezer Blackwood's power. Fear, cold and immediate, seized Augustus Caldwell. "You see, Rebecca," he pleaded, his face ashen, as he held the note with trembling hands. "You've poked the bear. Ebenezer Blackwood is not a man for games. He will ruin us." Rebecca looked at her father, at the terror in his eyes that had governed so much of her life, and found her own fear supplanted by a hardened resolve. "And what should I do?" "Father, apologize for telling the truth. Go back to being the invisible girl in the corner. Their threat is proof that the songs matter. People are listening." "Let them listen to someone else," he retorted, his voice strained with desperation. "This is not your fight." "It became my fight the moment Silas insulted me, and you threw the wrong man out of your store," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I will not be silenced by a bully's threat." Her defiance was admirable, but it could not pay the bills. The Blackwoods' retaliation was swift and suffocating. It began with the suppliers. Men who had traded with Augustus for a decade suddenly had exclusive contracts with Blackwood Enterprises. The freight agent at the train depot misplaced their shipments. Then came the notice the rent on their building, owned by a holding company that traced back to Ebenezer, was being so doubled effective immediately. Augustus, a man who had built his life on predictability and balanced ledgers, watched in horror as his livelihood crumbled before his eyes. The whispers in town shifted again, the admiration for Rebecca's courage now tinged with pity. She had been brave, yes, but foolishly so. The Blackwoods were simply too powerful. Jedediah Thorne heard the news as it traveled on the wind past between homesteaders with worried eyes. He knew he could not stay away. A ban from the mercantile meant nothing when Rebecca was in danger. He rode into redemption, not in the dead of night, but in the full light of day, his presence a deliberate challenge. He found Rebecca in the small yard behind the store, staring at the eviction notice. "I heard," he said. His voice was all she needed to hear. She looked up, the relief so palpable it was a physical force. "Jedediah, they are trying to crush us. To make an example of me? Then we will not make it easy for them," he said, his jaw set with grim determination. He stepped closer, his dark eyes searching her face. It was then he told her everything of his wife Mary and their son Samuel taken by cholera. of the crushing silence of his old life and the vow he'd made to disappear into the noise of the frontier. "For years I let sorrow silence me," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "I came here to be a ghost. But you, Rebecca, your voice reminded me what it feels like to be alive. I will not let fear silence you now. Truth in a place like this is worth fighting for." His vulnerability forged the final link in their bond. This was no longer a secret friendship. It was an alliance. Their first act of defiance was a direct challenge to Ebenezer's control. Jedediah organized the smaller homesteaders, all of whom were being squeezed by the Blackwood-owned grist mill. Together they formed a convoy, pooling their resources to haul their wheat on a 2-day journey to a competing mill in the next county. It was a small rebellion, but it was a start. It showed the town that fear was not the only option. The gesture enraged Silas Blackwood. His authority was being questioned, his dominance mocked. He grew reckless. He and his ranch hands began to ride roughshod over the homesteaders, driving cattle through unfenced cornfields, and in a particularly cruel move, damming the small creek that supplied water to several farms, including Jedediah's. The tension in redemption became a powder keg waiting for a spark. Silas drunk on power, and whiskey was about to light the match. The fire started just after dusk. Rebecca was in the mercantile with her father, the lamp on the desk casting long shadows as they pored over the grim, dwindling accounts. A strange, acrid smell drifted through the door, followed by a faint orange glow, painting the windows. "My God!" Augustus gasped, rushing to the street. "The livery stable is on fire!" The frantic clang of the fire bell shattered the evening quiet. Men poured from the saloon, and their homes forming a desperate bucket brigade from the town well. The blaze was already an inferno. The old dry timber of the stable roaring as it was consumed. The terrified screams of horses trapped in their stalls was a sound of pure horror. Jedediah, riding back into town from a meeting with the other homesteaders, saw the angry glow against the sky and spurred his horse into a gallop. He joined the bucket line without a word, his powerful frame a grim engine of efficiency against the hopeless flames. Rebecca ran toward the chaos, her heart pounding. Through the shifting veils of smoke she saw him, Silas Blackwood. He and his cronies weren't helping. They were watching from a safe distance, their faces lit by the fire, twisted in expressions of drunken amusement. Then her eyes caught something on the ground near the back of the stable, away from the main blaze. It was a discarded torch, still smoldering. Arson. A cold certainty washed over her. This was Silas. A drunken whim, a calculated act of terror, it didn't matter. He had finally gone too far. As the livery's roof began to groan, a new wave of horror rippled through the crowd. "Thomas, has anyone seen my Thomas?" It was the sheriff's wife, her voice, a shriek of maternal panic. Her 8-year-old son, who loved to play in the hayloft, was missing. Before anyone could stop him, Jedediah moved. He broke from the line, dunked a heavy horse blanket in a water trough, and wrapped it around his head and shoulders. "Jedediah, no!" Rebecca screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the roar. He charged into the burning maw of the stable. The crowd watched, frozen in a state of collective, horrified prayer. The building groaned, spitting sparks and embers. For an eternity, there was nothing but the sound of the fire. Just as hope began to fade, a figure stumbled out of the inferno. It was Jedediah, blackened and scorched, the limp form of the boy cradled in his arms. He took 3 steps, laid the child gently on the ground, and collapsed. The town doctor rushed to Thomas, who after a few terrifying moments began to cough and then cry he was alive. But Jedediah lay deathly still, his lungs ravaged by smoke. As Rebecca ran to his side, Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of grief and cold fury, strode towards Silas Blackwood. The passive acceptance of the Blackwoods' rule had just turned to ash. "You did this," the sheriff said, his voice shaking with rage. "I saw you. You're under arrest, Silas, for arson and attempted murder." Silas paled. "You can't prove a thing, Brody." "Gus Walt," the sheriff barked, turning to Silas's cronies. "You can testify against him, or you can hang with him." The choice was simple. Their loyalty bought with whiskey was not worth a noose. "It was his idea, Sheriff," Gus stammered. "He threw the torch." The confession sealed it. As the sheriff hauled the sputtering bully away, Rebecca was already fighting a different battle. "We need to get him inside," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "To the mercantile." Several townsmen helped carry Jedediah's still form into the store. In that moment, Rebecca was transformed. The quiet shop girl became a field general in a war against death. She dispatched people for bandages, clean water, and whiskey to sterilize the wounds. Her father, his business, worries forgotten, worked beside her, his eyes filled with a new and profound respect for the man he had banished. For 2 days, Rebecca was a constant presence at Jedediah's side. She gently cleaned and dressed his burns, spoon-fed him broth, and spoke to him in a low, constant murmur. And when the fever raged, when he thrashed in delirium, she sang. She sang the hymns of comfort and the quiet melodies of the prairie. She sang the song of the man with the wall around his heart. Her voice was his anchor in the storm, a thread of life, pulling him back from the brink. On the morning of the 3rd day, he opened his eyes. The fever was gone. He was weak, but he was lucid. He looked at her, his rescuer, his muse. "Rebecca," he rasped. "I'm here," she whispered, taking his bandaged hand. "You saved me," he said. "You saved that boy," she replied softly. "You showed everyone what real courage is." A faint smile touched his lips. "No," he whispered, his gaze holding hers. "Your voice. I heard you singing in the dark. That's what I came back for." Outside, the town of Redemption was being cleansed by fire. Its fear was burned away, replaced by a collective will. The quiet woman and the silent man had started a revolution. She with her voice had spoken the truth, and he with his actions had given the town the courage to believe it. The dust of redemption settled, but it was a new kind of dust, no longer tasting of fear and resignation, but of hope and hard-won freedom. The Blackwood Empire fell not with a roar, but with the quiet scratching of pens on legal documents as their assets were seized and their crooked contracts voided. Silas was sentenced to a long prison term, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered to unruly children. Jedediah recovered his scars, a testament not to the violence he had endured, but to the life he had saved. He did not return to his lonely homestead. He and Rebecca, with her father's tearful blessing, were married by Reverend Dodson in the rebuilt community church, a church whose new roof was a symbol of the town's collective spirit. They took over the mercantile, but they ran it differently. It became a place of fairness and community, a true heart for the town. Rebecca never stopped singing, but her songs were no longer confined to the root cellar. They were sung at town gatherings, at weddings, and on quiet evenings, on the porch of the mercantile, her voice weaving into the fabric of redemption's new story. She sang of love found in unlikely places, of the strength of a quiet heart, and of the courage it takes to speak the truth. She was no longer the unseen woman, the plain girl dismissed by cowboys. She was Rebecca Caldwell Thorne, the woman whose voice had toppled a tyrant and healed a broken man. And in the eyes of the man who sat beside her, the quiet one who had first asked for her voice, she was, and always would be, the most beautiful woman in all of Dakota. The story of Rebecca and Jedediah is a reminder that the strongest voices often come from the quietest corners, and that true worth is never just skin deep. If their journey from rejection to redemption moved you, please let us know in the comments below. What part of their story resonated with you the most? Your engagement helps our community grow. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share it with someone who loves a story of courage and unexpected love. Most importantly, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the heart of the Old West. Thank you for listening, and may you always find the courage to let your own voice be heard.